Hi everyone. We're just going to wait for folks to join. We'll give people a few minutes. There's Guy. Guy has joined us now. Hi, Guy.
Hello. Hello, hello. Hi, Ellie.
We'll give Brandon a couple more seconds. All right, and now we have Brandon. Hello.
Hello, Ellie.
And we have Guy here too. So I think we're just about ready to get started. Um, First, welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us today. This is our first clinical team update as the program is entering a new stage. And we wanted to start this opportunity to share more updates with the community as the program progresses. So let's start with a few introductions. I'm delighted to introduce Guy. Do you want to take a few moments just to introduce yourself?
Of course. Guy Ayalon, I'm the Chief Drug Development Officer for the FOXG1 Research Foundation, and very excited to be kicking off with you and Brandon our first clinical team update.
All right, Brandon, you're
Well,
up.
hello, I'm Dr. Brandon Henry. I am the Chief Medical Officer of the FOXG1 Research Foundation. Like Guy, very excited to be here with our first clinical trial update as we, get ready to get into clinic. So,
Thank you. And I'll be your host today. I'm Ellie. I oversee our clinical data for the foundation. And so, we first wanted to start by sharing that we've received many emails and questions from families all around the world. And today is going to be an opportunity for us to dig a little bit deeper into those questions. But we did want to share that we've recently launched a new website, FOXG1GeneTherapy.org. And many of the questions that we will talk about today are addressed there as well. So, our plan for today is we're going to talk a little bit about the current status of the program, the study design, what the experience looks like for families, and then we will also be answering some of the questions that we've heard from families as well. So, I think to start us off, before we really dig into a lot of the details, Guy, I was hoping you could share a little bit with us about where the program stands today and what the team is really working towards now.
Yeah, of course. So maybe, Ellie, if we can move to the next
Sure.
slide, we try to summarize with just a few bullets where we are today. So, as I believe most know, as we have announced earlier this year, our IND has been cleared by the FDA, which really means that we have the green light to proceed toward initiation of the clinical trial. In addition to that, the program FRF-001 received several regulatory designations from FDA, including orphan drug designation, rare pediatric disease designation, and fast track designation. And what this means in practical terms is that we have greater access to more interactions and dialogue with the agency, um, as well as the potential for acceleration of certain aspects of the review process by FDA. All this means is potential positive impact on the overall program timeline. And as we know, time is of the essence. Um, so today, what really is between us and initiating the enrollment for the clinical trial is the completion of the contracting process with our prospective clinical sites. This is a sort of complex process. We are in advanced stages of it, and we expect to be completing this in the coming weeks and initiating enrollment right after. Um, so this is where we are today. I think that Ellie, before we get into the details of the trial itself, if we can move to the next slide,
Sure.
I um, I'd like to emphasize what is our goal. And our goal is really to develop a safe and effective treatment for FOXG1 syndrome that can be broadly available to the global community as early as possible. And understanding this goal is important because this goal shapes our planning and our strategy in terms of how we design the clinical trial and how we approach our clinical development in general. So maybe to start with, I'd like to emphasize that while we are genuinely excited about the initiation of the clinical trial itself is not the goal. It is the vehicle. It is the means to achieve the goal. A clinical trial is by definition limited in terms of how many patients we can dose. What we really want is to get to a place where we have an approved drug that allows us to dose the broad patient community globally. A trial will always be a necessary step to get to that, but it's not the goal itself. And therefore, what we want is to design the most efficient trial possible because the most efficient trial possible allows us to achieve the goal faster. We took several approaches to our design. We are employing an innovative strategy that allows us to conduct a trial without a placebo group, which really means that every participant in the trial will receive the study treatment. In other words, we're not going to have any patients that will not be receiving treatment. Number one, we are aiming for a single pivotal study. Usually, in most clinical development plans, you have more than one clinical trial on your path to approval. We're trying to accomplish everything within a single study, and one of our ways of achieving that, this is utilizing the Citizen Health FOXG1 Natural History Study. We're including a broad age range and a broad spectrum of genotypes. Our hope is for FRF-001 to be safe and effective for a broad range of FOXG1 patients. And we are taking an early engagement approach to align with multiple regulatory agencies, not just FDA in the US, but outside of the US as well. If we look at the sort of the picture at the bottom, we have like two lines, colorful lines, and the top one is trying to walk from left to right of the screen, the path, the clinical sort of clinical development path or program strategy path from early basic research through the non-clinical work, etc. But what I really want to emphasize is if you look at the top row or top line, which is what we see as average pharmaceutical timeline for drug development from start of the program to, on the far left, to approval of a drug on the far right. At the bottom is the timeline, relative timeline for FRF-001. And I think that it's easy to appreciate that it is much shorter, which is another way of saying much faster. If we look, especially on the right-hand side of the top line, so we have a blue there that represents the phase 1/2, which is usually the first trial, which on average takes about 4 years. And then to the right of that, the purple line, which is the phase 3, which again takes approximately 4 years. That's on average. If you now look, so combined for the clinical trial phase, we're looking at approximately 8 years. Now, if you look at the bottom line, which is our projected time for FRF-001, there's a single phase 1/2 that we're estimating at 3 years. So this 3 years versus 8 years really emphasizes the where we are today in our projected timeline for testing FRF-001 in the clinic. If we move to the next slide, um, then to achieve, again, that shortening of the timeline to approval and hopefully achieve our goal faster, this has operational implications that enable this speed. And one of the considerations is the need to balance the number of patients and number of sites in order to optimize the efficiency. We receive many emails. You talked about this earlier, Ellie, in your opening remarks, and we've been receiving many dozens, actually we're talking in the hundreds now, emails from families, which we're grateful for. And it's this connection and dialogue with the community is essential. And a lot of the questions that we received revolved around, can you enroll more patients? Can you open more sites? Can we open more sites in more countries? And the answer is, if we do, and you look at that bottom line with that blue 3 year, stretch, the increase in the size in the number of patients, number of sites, number of countries means that we're pushing out that blue line further and further to the right, which means that then we are almost sort of we're slowing down the rate or the speed in which we might be able to achieve the goal. So yeah, I really like to emphasize that the reason that we're keeping the numbers as they are is because those are the numbers that we estimate are going to enable to test safety and efficacy in the clinic for FRF-001 without pushing the timelines out in a way that would push the goal out. One other point to emphasize here before we move on is that for all the families that reach out to us that do not live in the US, approval outside of the US doesn't necessarily require a clinical trial site outside of the US. This is part of the reason for the dialogue that we're having now with agencies, regulatory agencies outside of the US to get alignment with them. But I want to make sure that families understand that we cannot open a site in every country because it's not feasible. Even huge pharmaceutical companies don't do that, but also that is not a requirement in order to seek approval for a commercial drug later on, should the clinical trial be successful. So,
Wow, that was
yeah.
really great to hear, Guy. Thank you for explaining it so clearly. So you've really outlined this ambitious plan that we have and talked about the study overall. Can you get into a little bit more detail and talk about what the trial structure itself will look like?
Sure. So I'll give a high-level overview, and then Brandon will dive into the details. But the trial is designed as a 12-patient study, and 12 would be the total number of patients. So it's not the number of patients per site or per country. This is in total. We will have the possibility of expanding by a few additional patients. This will be based on emerging clinical data, but not something that we can um, decide at this point in time. Um, all the participants in the trial will receive the same dose level. There are some trials where you can see lower dose and middle dose and high dose. In our trial, all the patients will be receiving the same dose level, and we will have two groups in the trial. The first group or cohort will be comprised of participants between the ages of 11 and 20. There are going to be 4 patients at this age range, followed by the second group or second cohort of 8 patients between the ages of 2 and 10. The administration of the treatment of the gene therapy is going to be through an intracerebroventricular administration, or ICV. Brandon will give more information about that shortly. The trial duration is 2 years, and we'll walk through what that journey during those 2 years would look like. And importantly, the enrollment into the trial is going to be on a rolling basis. So we anticipate that the 12 patients in the study would enroll over a period of, it's going to take, anywhere from likely 9 to 12 months or so. Not all participants are selected today or in the coming weeks and notified right away. This is going to be on a rolling basis. And so if families don't hear from the sites about enrollment in the coming weeks, it doesn't mean anything yet, because notification will come on a rolling basis in the coming months. I think that's the high level overview, and more details Brandon will provide.
Perfect. So yes, Brandon, we're going to turn it over to you now. So from the moment a family learns that they're enrolled in the study, what are the next 2 years going to look like for those families?
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. So I'm going to walk through a general picture of what that process looks like. The full details will be reviewed directly with families through the study team and during the informed consent process. The first thing I want to emphasize is that, this is a clinical trial of an investigational therapy. The purpose of this study is to carefully evaluate the safety, the tolerability, and whether there are any, signs of meaningful clinical effect. For a family that is contacted and decides to move forward with potential participation in the study, the first stage is screening in the baseline period. This is where the clinical team confirms whether the child meets the study criteria. They collect baseline information to give us an understanding of what that patient, where that patient's at, all before any treatment is given. So this includes things like reviewing the medical history, physical and neurologic exams, lab testing, imaging, different types of developmental assessments. The reason baseline is so important is that, FOXG1 syndrome, as we all know, affects many different domains: movement, communication, sleep. There's seizures, all different types of developmental challenges, feeding, daily function issues. So we need to understand each participant's starting point as clearly as possible before we can interpret anything that happens after. Now, once we get through the screening and baseline period, which is relatively short, only a 2-week period, we move into the dosing period. And this involves an inpatient hospital stay of a few days. This is in place so that we can enable really close monitoring of the patient and facilitate administration of FRF-001. The child will be closely observed by the clinical team during this period and the period, immediately after treatment. So let's talk for a minute about how the gene therapy is administered. And if we can move to the next slide, we can show a figure sort of what this looks like. So FRF-001, as Guy mentioned, is administered by intracerebral ventricular injection, what we will call ICV injection. This means that the therapy is delivered into one of the fluid-filled spaces of the brain called the lateral ventricle. These ventricles contain a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, and the CSF circulates through and around the brain and spinal cord. The procedure is performed by a neurosurgeon under anesthesia. So they make a small incision, a little nick into the scalp. Then a very small opening is made into the skull. Through that opening, we place a thin catheter that's passed directly into the lateral ventricle. And the study treatment is then administered through that catheter into the CSF space. After the treatment is then delivered, the catheter is removed, the incision is closed, we suture him up, and the child is then monitored closely in the hospital for a couple days, just to ensure that everything is going well. Now, the reason that we chose, ICV injection for FOXG1 is that it's primarily a brain disorder, and ICV administration allows the intended delivery of the therapy directly to the central nervous system, rather than approaches relying, for example, on an IV infusion, where you'll have to use a larger amount of virus in order to reach the brain. So this approach really allows us to try to reach as many brain cells as possible and as directly and close to that as possible. Now, Ellie, going back to what the sort of study timeline looks like, the first, several weeks after dosing are a very important period for monitoring. So this is, when we're really focused on, looking for any types of adverse events,
Mhm.
making sure that the patient's, doing well, that they've recovered from the procedure. So families should really expect, the first, couple weeks post, treatment to really be intense periods of follow-up. So this will be, a number of different clinical assessments, lab monitoring, review of any symptoms, and a lot of really frequent communication with the study team. Some visits are in clinic. Some later visits may be performed through, say, home health, in which a nurse will come to the patient's home to evaluate the patient, or telehealth, virtual visits, where there'll be an opportunity to communicate with the study team through very similar to what we're doing right here. So it all depends really on the protocol schedule. Different sites are going to have different procedures, but practically, I think for families, Ali, really, the message I want to get home is that, the first month is not going to be an immediate return to normal life.
Mm.
It's a period where the study team is going to be watching closely, where families need to be highly engaged, and where any new symptoms or concerns should really be promptly communicated to the study team.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we've made it to dosing. We've made it to that first period that will be a little bit more intense. For families who are thinking about that longer arc, what comes next for them? What do the next 2 years look like in the study?
Great question, Ellie. Maybe we can jump ahead to this slide here. I think this really shows an overview of what it looks like. So after the early dose, the early post-dose period, the study moves into the post-dose follow-up time. Um, the main study, the clinical trial itself, follows participants for approximately 2 years. During that time, we'll monitor for both safety and any potential clinical changes indicative of clinical benefit. Safety monitoring, as I mentioned earlier, will include things like looking for adverse events, labs, exams, imaging. And the study will also include, a number of different developmental and functional assessments intended to assess that potential clinical benefit and evaluate domains, that matter to patients with FOXG1 syndrome, including motor function, communication, sleep, adaptive behavior. So we'll be looking at all of that throughout this period. So as the study, progresses, the visits become less frequent, as you can see here. So there's a lot of visits over the first several weeks. Then we will have, after we get to like week 12, the visits start to space out a bit. So we'll have a visit at 6 months, a visit at 9 months, a visit at 1 year. And then as we move into year two, again, it becomes even more infrequent, but with visits frequently at about every 3 months. Like some of those are telehealth visits, as you can see here. Again, noting though that it may be specific to the individual site in that particular patient, and what is the best approach for that specific family. Now, after the initial 2 year study, families will then be asked to participate in a long-term follow-up program for a period of up to 3 years, which means patients will be followed for a total of 5 years post-dose. The long-term follow-up is important because gene therapy is intended to have durable biologic effects, and we need to understand both the potential benefit and any potential delayed safety findings over that time. The mechanism which that long-term follow-up will be conducted will be discussed with the agency. But the key point that I think I want to hit home is that this is a long-term commitment. It's not just a procedure and a few visits afterwards. Families who participate in this program are contributing really to a structured 2 year evaluation and potentially additional long-term follow-up for 3 years beyond that.
That was great. Thank you so much, Brandon. Before we move on to talk about some of the questions community members had, I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about one of the questions that we heard the most, which is, what does enrollment look like?
Yeah, Ellie, this is a really one of the most important topics. We get a lot of questions about it. So eligibility for the study is based on clinical, genetic, safety, developmental, and operational criteria that are all defined in the protocol. We know every family in this community wants this urgently. However, selection has to be driven by the study design and what gives the trial the best chance to answer the key safety and efficacy questions responsibly. Um, the trial includes two main age cohorts, as I mentioned. The first cohort is older participants, ages 11 to 20, and the second cohort is younger participants, ages 2 to 10. Now, that sequence is intentional. We'll start with the older cohort, and this allows us really to, evaluate safety in a way that, is aligned with what the FDA is looking for in a first-in-human gene therapy program. So we're committed to making sure that, we go stepwise in a very safe manner. Now, medical records are a really important part of understanding whether a child may fit the clinical criteria, which is, why we sent out the survey, to families and asking them to, share their citizen files. The citizen records help us organize and review the relevant medical history. That said, final eligibility is determined only through the formal study screening process at the clinical site and determined by the investigator at that respective site. Now, I think it's really important to mention, Ellie, that many children may fit, the study criteria and many will not. And because this is a very small trial, as Guy mentioned, many children who appear potentially eligible still may not be enrolled. Not being selected for the trial, should not be interpreted about, as a judgment on the child's value, the severity of their condition, whether they might ever be able to receive treatment in the future. The goal of the study is to generate the cleanest possible evidence as fast as possible to demonstrate, safety and efficacy so that if the program is successful, the path can move towards broader availability as fast as possible.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Just before we move on, there were a few points that Guy and Brandon have shared that I want to reiterate as we're thinking about enrollment, since this is such an important topic for families. So first, again, just to confirm that enrollment has not started yet, and no one has been contacted about a specific spot, a specific spot. But when the time comes, families will be notified. And as Guy mentioned, enrollment is going to happen over the course of the trial on a rolling basis. So that means that these notifications will go out gradually and not all at once. And then another important point that we wanted to share is that families who are not selected for the trial are not going to receive individual notifications, but we're going to continue to share program-wide updates like this webinar today. And the goal there is to make sure that every family is informed of the program's progress, even if you're not individually contacted for the study. So, just a couple points on what some of the support will look like for the trial. So, we understand that, everything Guy and Brandon have described is a very big commitment for families. And we know that this is a significant undertaking. And we don't want logistics to be the reason why a family can't participate. So, FRF will be providing support to cover things like travel and lodging and food related to the visits. And we're going to work with the families one-on-one to understand what they need, as we know that every family's circumstances are going to be a little bit different. So, one last point that we wanted to share is that we also have a broader research effort that is complementary but different to the clinical trial. And this is a prospective natural history study. So, both Guy and Brandon have mentioned the retrospective citizen natural history study that we have. But we are planning an additional study to really continue to strengthen the evidence and data that we have. And the goal here is going to be to collect information over time through structured assessments that are going to look very similar to the clinical trial itself. So there are 2 points that we want to be very clear on. The first is that if you were to enroll in this prospective natural history study, it won't affect your child's prospects for being enrolled in the clinical trial. So it doesn't help their prospects, but it also doesn't hurt either. And then, second, just to reaffirm that eligibility for the clinical trial is based entirely on those criteria that Brandon has already described. And so it's not going to be dependent on whether you participate in this natural history study or not. So, really, the goal behind this study is to collect data that will give us important context for how we interpret the information coming from the clinical trial. And it will help us differentiate what we're seeing in terms of whether that's related to the treatment or a part of the natural course of FOXG1 syndrome. So, for families who are interested in contributing to the science but whose child isn't selected for the clinical trial, this could be a really meaningful way to contribute your data and your participation. So, we'll be sharing more about this opportunity over the summer, but wanted to give you a little bit of advance notice as we're talking to you today. So with that, I think we're going to move into some of the Q&As. So these are questions that we have heard from families over the past several months. And I think I'm gonna kick it off with Guy. So one of the questions we've heard a lot is when is the trial actually going to start? Oh, you're on mute, Guy.
Thank you. Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, we are now in the final stages of contracting, um, which is another way of saying it's about logistical aspects of of finalizing the startup activities. And I expect that in the coming weeks that will all be complete and enrollment will begin. I think that we're
Okay,
getting very close.
it's very exciting.
Yes.
Where are the sites going to be?
So we will, as soon as the contracts are sealed, then we will be announcing the sites. Until then, it's just slightly premature. We just want to make sure that everything is squared away, and we will be announcing as soon as the sites are the contracting is completed, and it will also be appear on our clinicaltrials.gov listing. But of course, I'm sure that the foundation will be communicating this through our all breadth of channels, communication channels, newsletters, social media, etc.
Great. Are you able to speak at all about whether there would be any sites outside of the US?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is it is still to be determined, and it will mainly be determined by the outcome of the conversations that we are and will continue to have with the agencies outside of the US. And that's how we'll determine if and when if there's a need. If there's no
Okay.
need for approval outside of the US, then once again, it may make the study longer and more expensive if we do that. So we will do it if we need to, and we will we will continue to update the community as soon as we have more information.
Okay, great. What if a family is interested in participating, but they don't live in the same country as one of the sites? Is there a path for them to participate?
Yeah, so as we said earlier, multiple times, I think in recent months, the trial is open to participants outside of the US. So at this point in time, we are looking to open the first sites in the US, and families that live outside of the US that are part of the Citizen Health NHS and filled the surveys are part of the pool of families that will be pre-screened for participation.
Okay, great. The next set of questions I have, I think, are a good fit for Brandon. So, one of the questions we've received is when is the treatment going to be available for everyone? And do we know what countries the treatment would be available in?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ellie. And the honest answer is we don't know yet. FRF-001 is still investigational, and availability outside of the clinical trial will depend on whether the study is successful, how regulators in different countries evaluate that data, what approval or access pathways are available and in each country. The goal, as Guy mentioned, is broad availability for the entire global FOXG1 community, but we can't, commit to any specific timing, approval, or country-specific access at this stage. What we can say is that the trial is designed to answer the questions needed to move the program forward as efficiently as possible.
Okay. And then, both you and Guy talked about the cohorts that will be eligible in the study. And it looks like the current youngest age posted is 2. So for families who have children who are under the age of 2, are they going to be eligible to be treated?
So for this study at this time, the main protocol age range begins at 2 years of age. Children under 2 are currently not part of phase 1/2 trial design. Now that said, that does not mean that younger children would, not be considered in the future. In many gene therapy development programs, the initial study population is intentionally limited. And later, as, safety data emerges, decisions are made about the potential for inclusion of younger children. So as we start to see the safety, efficacy, the clinical data, we may be able to make and adapt the plan. But we'll keep the FOXG1 community informed as the trial progresses with respect to any changes and eligibility for patients under the age of 2.
Okay. And then how will families know if their child is eligible to participate?
So the only way to really know if your child is eligible to participate is going through the formal study process at the study sites as for patients are informed that they've been selected to participate. General information can help families understand the trial, but eligibility can only really be determined after really going through a thorough process that includes you know a variety of different tests, imaging, and other procedures. The study team has to review all of that information, the patient's entire medical history, and evaluate whether or not they are, both, going to be, positioned to be, safe.
Mm.
That safety is really at the top of our mind and ensuring that, and that they meet all those specific protocol parameters. So if a family is contacted, the site will walk them through the screening and consent process in detail.
Okay. And then I think this is our last question. If someone has a child who's not selected for the trial, are they going to have a chance to receive the treatment later on?
Yeah, Ellie, I want to answer this question with both honesty and care. As Guy mentioned, this initial trial is small, and not every potential child will be enrolled. The study is also designed with rolling enrollment and staggered dosing so that there's intervals between patients. So as Guy, we all have mentioned, the patients will not be contacted all at once. Some families may be contacted earlier, others later in the year or even next year, depending on the cohort, site readiness, screening, safety review steps, and the overall pace of dosing at the sites. So if you're not contacted right away, that does not mean that your child has been ruled out. The process will take time, and it's important that the FOXG1 community really remains as patient as possible as the study progresses. We know, you know, waiting is difficult; it's hard, but we will continue to update the community as we are able. Now, if a child is not selected or is not eligible for this specific study, that does not mean that they'll necessarily never have access to treatment in the future. I want to reiterate that. Future access, though, will depend, on the results of this study, the regulatory decisions, potential additional studies that may have to be conducted, and whether the, therapy, eventually becomes approved or available through another pathway. So the answer is possibly, but we cannot promise that today. The best thing we can do right now is conduct this first trial as rigorously, safely, efficiently as possible so that if the program's successful, we can move as quickly as possible to broader global availability. And that is our number one goal.
All right. Well, a big thank you to both of you for sharing so much with the community today and really for all of the work that you're doing behind the scenes. This is a really big milestone for our community, and there's a lot of hard work ahead, but I think everyone is pretty excited about the progress that's been made so far.
Well, thank you, Ellie. And I want to take this opportunity to also thank the broader clinical team. We have the privilege of speaking with the community, the three of us today, but their additional team members are doing really hard and incredible job. And we are all very much looking forward and are excited to enter this next step of the first clinical trials for FOXG1 syndrome.
Great. So just a reminder, you will find the answers to many of the questions we discussed today at foxg1genetherapy.org. And stay tuned as we would like to continue providing these updates to the community via webinar as well. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to Guy and Brandon and to the broader FOXG1 Research Foundation. And we look forward to sharing more with you in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ali.